Welcome, my name is Joaquin Nunez for Postmedia, and with me today is Jenna Bentley, Director of Government Affairs at the Goldwater Institute in Phoenix, Arizona. Ms. Bentley, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about the Goldwater Institute and the work that you guys are doing there?
Sure. So we are a nonprofit based in Phoenix, Arizona, and we work in both public policy and litigation, defending constitutional rights. So when we're talking about constitutional rights, we're talking about property ownership, free speech, Second Amendment, low taxes.
Nice. And moving on to the economy, recently the Mercatus Center published a ranking that showed that Democrats run 7 out of the 10 most regulated states in the country. Your thoughts about that?
I think it shows, when we have increased regulation and especially a lot of occupational licensing, it serves as a barrier to entry for a lot of people into the workforce. And I think when people usually hear occupational licensing, they might think of doctors or nurses or accountants. But the truth of the matter is most of the occupational licenses we see in most states really are going after to the middle or low income occupations. And when it can cost sometimes thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars to get the educational requirements met for those occupations, then for them to go out and maybe only be able to find a minimum wage job and have to go into debt, that's really problematic. And that's something that should be considered in all states.
And with that being said, for like the daily life of the citizens, what can be the consequences for adding too many regulations to a state economy?
Sure. Well, for one thing, when we look at people who are, in low-income areas, it makes economic mobility very, very difficult for them because if you're struggling to make money and then the barrier to try to get a better job that could potentially pay more as an occupational license, and you can't afford that license, that keeps you trapped in that kind of economic sector. And then we've also seen a lot of reports that when there's too many occupational license requirements or too many regulations, it actually hurts economies. We saw one report recently that said, occupational licensing requirements cost the Arizona economy almost $3 billion annually. And that's because we have jobs that go unfulfilled. And we probably lose about, 30,000, employees that could be actively in those areas.
Sure. Moving on to the national scene, I want you to address Bidenomics. How do you rate President Biden's presidency in the economy?
Well, I would say if we're looking at, people being able to get a job, we're looking at cost of gas, cost of groceries. I think it's pretty easy for all of us to say that, we've all felt the hits from that. Gas is still expensive. You're trying to buy a house, maybe you're a first-time home buyer, and mortgage rates are very, very high, relatively speaking, to what they've been the past few years. And so, I think that there's probably a direct correlation to some of the federal policies that are being enacted that impacts these things. It impacts Americans' abilities to kind of live at, their best potential with their economic means.
Recently, Vice President Harris announced a series of proposals, of course, on the economy, like a federal price control or an increase of the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%. Do you think that's a good way to start a presidency of Harris?
Those definitely wouldn't be the reforms that I would look to. When you start trying to change the tax brackets and overtax some people and undertax some, that never really, leads to economic success. I think we can kind of look at, when our economy has been successful, when there has been low unemployment rates, we can look at who's been in office then. And I think there's a contrast to those policies for sure.
And for those of us that aren't following Arizona politics, is Katie Jobs doing a good job over there?
Well, you know, I will say that Arizona definitely has some areas that we're struggling. You know, occupational licensing is something that, you know, we always need to make sure that we're keeping our boards and commissions in control, that they're not kind of expanding their authority. But, you know, immigration still remains a huge issue. The homelessness here in Arizona has really kind of reached kind of a you know, crisis level. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is a lot of government officials just sort of turning a blind eye to this crisis. And meanwhile, the Arizona taxpayers, the property owners, are really having to fend for themselves.
Nice. And last question, do you have, I think, an important Senate election in November? Do you have any prediction?
You know, at this point, I kind of avoid making predictions in my career because I've been wrong in the past. But, you know, we've got some really important elections coming up, a lot of important, not only candidates on the November ballot, but also some propositions that,
Okay.
you know, people need to be aware of and I think will really impact the state of Arizona.
For example, a proposition that it's important to the public to know.
I would say Proposition 312. You know, I mentioned earlier that we have a real crisis going on with the homeless here in Arizona.
Mhm.
Retail theft is at an all-time high, and all of those things are kind of tied together. And sadly, you know, the cities have been kind of refusing to provide health and public safety services to address that by enforcing camping bans and, you know, enforcing laws like, you know, not allowing public intoxication and loitering. And what this does is it says if a property owner has had to take mitigation expenses, essentially have to take matters into their own hand to protect their property, then they're allowed a refund for those expenses. And so that's our way of giving relief to the taxpayer while also making sure that we hold our government officials responsible.
Okay. Well, Ms. Vendry, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.